Good afternoon and welcome to Pathbreakers, speaker series at George Mason, where we spend about 24 quick minutes speaking with thought leaders, executives, and change agents who are challenging the way in which we think about the delivery of higher education. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Ben Nelson, the CEO and founder of Minerva School, a competency-based approach to delivering undergraduate degrees. Just a couple words about Minerva, a very unusual and path-breaking structure, founded about 2013, ranging from liberal arts and humanities to data science and business. Minerva students now score at the 99th percentile for CLA plus tests. This is the benchmark collegiate test for problem solving and critical reasoning skills and competencies that we're interested in teaching across the board. And Minerva has global residencies. So this is a very unusual program, and I'm very honored to be joined by Ben Nelson. And so I thought I'd kick this off, Ben, with a quick question, big question, which is what prompted you to build Minerva? And maybe in that context, what is competency-based education, CBE?
Sure. Well, two interesting questions, not completely related, but similar. So what prompted me very simply is that the American higher education enterprise, it was not built like the rest of the global higher education. It was built specifically to enable a representative republic to function. It was built not to train particular crafts and trades that the government would want its citizens to have, like Germany or other places. It was built such that you would have an informed citizenry that could vote for elected officials to represent their interests, but more importantly, that those citizens, when called upon to serve themselves, can transfer their wisdom and skills and knowledge from one career to public service. And this was a revolutionary idea 250 years ago. And this was actually the source of the term the liberal arts. People think the liberal arts have something to do with poetry. That's completely not true. Liberal arts are the disciplines, the arts, that are necessary for you as a person to have liberty. Liberal arts. In order for you to have liberty, you have to be trained in the workings of society. And that's related to competency. Because if you don't have the competency to be an enfranchised citizen, the founding fathers believed you shouldn't be an enfranchised citizen, right? And that is the responsibility of liberty. And it's really our responsibility as institutions of higher education to train that. And the reason I started Minerva is because uniformly, universities have retreated from that very specific definition of what a liberal arts education is. Effectively, it's too important for our society to have universities keep doing what they're doing today.
So maybe, Ben, you could talk a little bit about that second part of the question, competency-based education. How do you, in a liberal arts context, as you suggest, evaluate and deliver competencies to students?
So one of the problems that competency-based education has gotten is that it has been associated with the transmission of really less competencies and more basic knowledge in an asynchronous way. Right. So, when people think about competency education, they think about, have you learned a certain math formula? And, there's some adaptive learning program that figures out on an asynchronous basis, you know how to apply it, and it'll ask you questions until you've demonstrated to the machine that you know it. But when you think about, again, those disciplines that you need to be an effective citizen, effective representative of other citizens in society, which, by the way, is the same set of competencies that you would think of that are important for professions, for being an active and good person among your friends and family. The abilities to think critically, the ability to solve problems in creative ways, the ability to think through second and third order effects and unintended consequences, the abilities to communicate with other people in effective ways. These are not things which an asynchronous knowledge transmission process is particularly useful for.
Yeah.
In fact, we believe that it doesn't work at all for these types of skills. And what we believe is that true competency-based education and the role of higher education, as opposed to the role of a software program, is one where you need an expert guidance and interaction of peers in order to exercise those components, those particular competencies.
Right.
So despite the fact that we believe that we are very much focused on, and we have evidence that we provide these competencies, provide these frameworks of thinking to our students, we are a very traditionally oriented 120 credit hour seat time, 4 courses a semester, 2 semesters a year, all classes taught by PhDs, live, synchronous type of model. So it's a very different approach to competency, and it involves, if I just may for one more minute, 2 important distinctions. The first is nuanced applications and mastery of the competency. So rather than saying yes, no, right, machine, you've got it correctly, you've got it incorrectly, right? Much more so on a rubric basis of how well did you apply this particular competency in this particular situation. So did you understand it superficially and kind of try to apply the textbook level without any real understanding, or did you have profound insight into the application of this competency, or anything in between? So that's one dimension, which is a much more granular and frankly human assessed assessment of how you've done the competency. And the second, which is perhaps even more important, is contextual. Right? True competency isn't about regurgitating a particular fact or concept in a context that you've learned it in. That's just memorization. True learning is the ability to transfer that particular concept from one area to another. And our entire curriculum is based on introducing dozens of these competencies, but then applying them, having the students apply them across disciplines, contexts, problems, etc., until they master these competencies in transferable ways.
Exactly. So my understanding is that you assess sort of students coming in for a certain level of competency, and then you test them along the way to see if they're achieving that level of competency. Could you give us just an example or two of what type of competency that is, and perhaps how that's assessed or developed in the course of your time?
Sure. So I'll give you a couple of. So we break our competencies into 2 categories: habits of mind and foundational concepts. Habits of mind are things that you can trigger the mind to recognize automatically, but that may be difficult to apply. So, for example, you can train somebody to learn what a claim is. Now, that sounds very rudimentary. You would say, anybody can recognize claims. But the fact of the matter is that the overwhelming majority of people can't distinguish between what are claims and what are presented as facts, or what are presented as a pure conjecture or opinion. Right? And so to actually ascertain what is a claim, it takes some training and a decent amount of education. Now, habit of mind can say, well, when you evaluate a claim, one technique could be to think of a counterclaim. Right? Now, very easy to go through a process, and with some time, you can train people to identify what a claim is, and then say, oh, I've identified a claim, now I should think of a counterclaim. The hard part is to actually figure out what that counterclaim is. Right? So that's an example of a habit of mind.
Perfect.
A foundational concept is actually a little bit of the opposite, which is it's relatively easy to teach you how to apply it. Right? You can think of any statistical tool, statistical distribution or Bayesian statistics or what have you. That is a tool. You can actually train somebody, every university in the world offers a statistics course, right? That'll give you all of those formulas. The hard part is to provide somebody intuition as to when to apply which tool to which problem.
Right.
And so that is an example of where transference is much more at the front of the identification process than at the end.
So I could be learning a concept in a math course, but then apply it to literature or philosophy conversations. Test it out and really understand.
Exactly. And in fact, the way we introduce these competencies is not in subject-oriented courses. The courses themselves are not interdisciplinary, they're non-disciplinary. They're meaning that the subject of the particular class is the broad systematic framework of thinking, right? Whether it be formal or empirical or complex or rhetorical systems, and then the underlying components of each of them. And we use thematic concepts and materials, right, for particular fields to illustrate these habits of mind and foundational concepts. But then we transfer those types of habits and concepts into other contexts very quickly.
So how many competencies, if I go to Minerva and I start tomorrow, how many competencies do I have to master by the end of 4 years?
So we introduce more than 80 competencies at the beginning of your tenure in your first year. And those are all the competencies that go across any of the particular learning objectives that we would introduce in a particular major or course or subject matter in the second, third, and fourth years. Right, so at the very basis, there are more than 80 general education concepts that you have to master during your 4 years. But some of these are quite heterogeneous. Right. So for example, when we first started Minerva 4 years ago, our initial list of habits and concepts numbered 128. Right. And in that list were not some of the ones that we are now teaching as part of the 80. So we've learned one of some of the missing pieces and we've added to them. So why is it that we have so many fewer than we had back then? Not because we're teaching less, we're actually teaching more. But what we've done is we've collapsed some particular applications of habits and concepts that we initially taught separately into larger capacities.
Sure.
And so we managed to cover more, but also then provide a more clear example of transference for our students.
So how's that working in sort of an actual sense? Am I in a classroom? Am I online? How does an instructor know if I'm learning a competency or not learning a competency?
Right. So in a number of different ways. So first and foremost, all of our classes are done via live video. And so the professor sees the students see the professor, the students see one another. So it's very much in a seminar type of environment. And in that seminar environment, the students are engaged in what we refer to as fully active learning. So much of the mistakes in the implementation of active learning is that some individuals believe that, hey, if you don't lecture, then you've moved away from passive, and if you ask student questions, now it's active. Well, that's not completely true, because though the student you're asking the question to may be actively engaged, doing deep processing, remembering much more than if you were to lecture at them, the other students in the class have just seen the lecture pass from professor to student. And so they're still passive.
Right.
And so fully active learning techniques ensure that all students in the class are engaged the vast majority of the time during class and doing deep processing and actually retaining the information and practicing the applications of their habits and concepts. Then the professors actually grade, they assess students on the applications of these habits and concepts, both in-class participation, because even though the classes are live, you can easily record them. They're all via webcams. And then the professor can go back, review what students have said, provide these types of assessments, and they assess their project work, their homework, on the same basis. And so what a student develops over time is an index of each one of their habits and concepts, the various capacities that they underpin, and the broad systems of thinking that they comprise. And you can see how a student has progressed over time in each one of those granular areas with an active link. So if you want to see, for example, how well you apply right problem, figuring out what the problem is that needs to be solved before starting to solve it, you can go into that particular habit or concept, click on it, and it will link back to everything you have said during your 4 years in class that got assessed for right problem, whether it was good or bad, everything that you've written in an assignment or a project that has been assessed in that regard. You can see your trend over time, and you have a cumulative index to see how well you've mastered it.
That probably requires a certain amount of technology. Would you say that you've been building that database, that tool for handing off the learner from one course to another course? Is that a big part of Minerva?
Exactly. So that requires really two things. It requires, of course, a technology that underpins that data structure and enables a professor to go from, or a student to go from one class to another without losing that data. But it also means that you have a curricular structure that enables it. Mm-hmm. Right? Because if you have, if you introduce a habit or concept, introduce right problem as an example, and then no course later on in the student's career addresses that particular concept, nor does the student get assessed on it, what's the point?
Right.
And so you actually have to create a curricular structure, a taxonomy that an institution can interleave throughout all of its courses later on. And we do it at the very least in our general education when we work with other institutions, mm-hmm. right? Such that you can have the ability to transfer these habits and concepts from one course to another.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you that question. There are a lot of lessons that you've learned in building an integrated curriculum, evaluating competency, focusing on active learning. Maybe what lessons have you taken away from building Minerva that you think might apply to a large traditional institution like George Mason?
Well, a couple of very important ones. The first one is that people oftentimes look at Minerva and they say, "Oh, well, you're small, and because you're small, it's easy to do what you're doing." But the fact of the matter is that all of the research that Minerva has been based on, everything that we've built, was done in large format. It was done when you had a 200-person lecture, and the professor would be delivering that lecture and then take the same professor, the same material, the same quality of students, the same course, delivered in an active learning way. And lo and behold, learning outcomes are up 7x, not 7%, not 70%, 7x. And that is perhaps the second most important lesson that we've learned, which is sometimes when you read research papers, you say, "Oh, well, that was done under, some mythical condition, which isn't applicable in the real world." Well, the science of learning can only be done in real-world applications. There really is nothing that you can simulate about it. It's real students, real professors, and all of the research was done in real scenarios. And so when you take the entire body of the science of learning and put it together in a new educational system, lo and behold, those effects are real. Mm-hmm. And so the perhaps the most urgent is just an internal conversation that universities have to have, which is, if we know that in the quote-unquote lab we have seen dramatic improvements, a bigger improvement than penicillin was to the sugar pill, right? So something that's completely unprecedented. And now we have an example of taking those types of results and having that type of outcome in the real world. Mm-hmm. How can we not go in that direction, right? Whether it is just creating your own way of teaching it, or using the system that we've built, because we've actually built it in order to be usable in a traditional institution of higher education, which is why we're time-based and oriented towards professors teaching and subject matter in courses, majors, minors, general education, etc.
We've talked about educating students. We've talked about the way in which they learn more actively in a competency environment. What about the advising part of it? So universities struggle with, how do I help students map their pathway through complex organization and get to an endpoint that matters to them? I imagine in a competency-based environment like Minerva, advising looks very different.
Yeah, so one of the benefits of advising in the Minerva context is again related to the curricular structure. And so much of the structure of our curriculum is based on informed choice. One of the problems that advising currently has in traditional university is that the structure of the university is highly limited and rigid. So you have the feeling or the appearance of choice, but imagine that you are a second semester sophomore or about to start your second semester sophomore year, and you all of a sudden say, you know what, I really want to major in biology, and I haven't taken any biochem, physics, calc, etc. Your choice is to be a student for 6 years. Right. And that's not exactly a good choice. Right. And so the problem is we're asking students throughout the country, pretty much anywhere, any university that exists, you're asking a student at 17 years old, sometimes 16, to basically know the range of what it is that they're interested in studying. And then they show up, they take a whole bunch of 101, 102 level courses that are almost all informational, right? It doesn't really give you a good glimpse of what the field is all about. And then the student is oftentimes stuck. And so it's less that advising is bad at universities. I'm sure some universities do it very well and some universities do it very poorly, as anything. But the problem is there's only so much that you can do with the advice. Whereas at Minerva, the entire process is informed choice. The first year, right, your first year curriculum has no choice whatsoever, right? All you're doing is your general education. But in that process, you're exposed to 30 different concentrations. You're exposed to major questions that are all cross-disciplinary in their nature that you grapple with and think through, right? And you are given then the opportunity to make informed choice when you choose from a narrow set of options in your second year, that then open up to a broader set of options in your third year, that open up to an infinite set of options in your senior year, where your education is fundamentally personalized to the individual. But at every step, the advising can actually coincide with your strengths, your weaknesses, and having a toe dip into the actual field as opposed to being in a situation where it's too late.
Ben, we have a couple minutes left. So just a quick response to this one. I'm going to pull you way up. How do you think about applying a lifetime learning model to a Minerva student? So after they've finished Minerva, they've used their competencies to demonstrate to employers what they're good at with a portfolio that's very different from a traditional transcript. I know we don't have time to discuss that. But how do you maintain a continual connection with your alumni for lifetime learning? And we've got 1 minute left.
Sure. Well, lifetime learning is almost useless unless you have the tools to effectively learn. And a good liberal arts education, right, what effectively we've put together at Minerva, is an intellectual framework through which you can learn anything. And that enables lifetime learning.
I love it. Yep. Thank you, Ben. This has been an insightful discussion. I know there's a lot more to discuss beyond the 24 minutes. So for those at George Mason, this will be archived on our New Ventures website. You can take a look at this conversation and certainly engage me, and we can ask Ben to return and talk to us more about life after Minerva, which I think is also a fascinating discussion. So thank you once again, and I appreciate all of you for joining us on Pathbreakers.
Thanks so much for having me.